G'day mate, 40 here. So Israel's just assassinated 3 of its biggest enemies in the Middle East. And what strikes me is the uniform nature of the very prim and proper 19th century Victorian gentleman reaction of the mainstream media. There is such a narrow emotional band allowed for reaction to news events. So all the news coverage that I see is that fear is dominating. Right now there's fear of a wider war in the Middle East, as though fear is the only appropriate, proper, prim and proper emotion to Israel assassinating 3 of its biggest enemies. I don't know, as a convert to Orthodox Judaism, I feel elation right now that Israel has assassinated 3 of its biggest enemies. But wherever you are on the political spectrum, right, this is why people seek out live streams and blogs and social media for a less hygienic, less prim and proper approach to the news and to life, right? As though fear is the only emotional response to a wider Middle East conflict, right? Wherever you are in your thinking on the Middle East, right, there are a whole host of emotions that you're likely to feel about a wider Middle East conflict, right? If you hate Israel, you might well welcome a wider Middle East conflict because you believe it will destroy the hated Zionist enemy. If you love Israel, you may well welcome a wider Middle East conflict because Israel can take the gloves off, give Hezbollah a proper thrashing, give Iran a proper thrashing, give Syria a proper thrashing, right? Give its enemies a proper thrashing, and restore a quality of life to Israel. And if you go to war, then you also need to take territory to properly punish your enemies, because no country can afford to maintain a military all along its borders to prevent an invasion, right? It's just not feasible. So a drug cartel in Mexico could organize hundreds of fighters to invade the United States and start slaughtering American civilians. And the only reason they do that is because they know that the United States would react with such ferocity that they would, hunt down and kill every major member of the cartel that organized such an invasion. And so Israel can't station military forces along every square foot of its border. The way that Israel survives as a nation state is through the ferocity of its retaliation. And so I'm no expert on the Middle East. I pay attention. But from what I'm reading, sure sounds like Hezbollah in Syria and Iran are much more strongly inclined to avoid a wider Middle East conflict than Israel. John Mearsheimer, no friend of Israel, he made the point that Israel would welcome an escalation of the Middle East conflict because that would give Israel an opportunity to ethnically cleanse Arabs out of Gaza and the West Bank. Israel is not really defensible without possession of the West Bank. Right? Israel is just such a tiny, vulnerable nation. To build up any kind of strategic depth, it needs to take over the West Bank. And so that means displacing millions of Arabs, and it's not a very nice thing to do, right? It's ethnic cleansing. It's a horrible thing. It's a terrible violation of international humanitarian law. But what's more important to you? Let's say you care about Israel. What's more important to you? Your fulfillment of international humanitarian law and human rights principles, or survival, right? Would you rather be morally clean and dead or morally dirty and alive? I think most people would rather be morally dirty and alive. And if you live in a tough neighborhood like Israel does, you have to be dirty. You have to kill a lot of people, and you have to continually resort to escalation dominance so that your enemies know that if they attack you, you're going to fight back much harder. And so far, since October 7, Israel has fought back hard in Gaza, but it has not fought back hard yet against Hezbollah. And from my reading of the news, Hezbollah and Iran are much more afraid of a wider Middle East conflict than Israel is. I mean, look at this brilliant strategic targeting. Israel has just assassinated 3 of its biggest enemies in 24 hours. Just boom, boom, boom. One of them they did in Tehran, one they did in Syria, and one they did in Beirut, Lebanon. All right? You don't think Israel's fired up and excited by this, and that you don't think that Israel has dozens of more targets that it's ready to take out. And also, let's face it, the IQ gap between Ashkenazi Israelis and their enemies is probably 20 IQ points. IQ matters, all right? When it comes to people with an IQ over 120 or over 130, I don't know exactly, is it 120, 130, 140, right? The majority of them live in Israel compared to Egypt or Gaza or Syria or Iran, right? The average IQ of most of Israel's neighboring enemies is about 82, right? The average Jewish IQ in Israel is over 100. So there's an enormous IQ gap between Israel and its enemies, which allows a nation of approximately 9 million Jews to consistently outcompete hundreds of millions of its enemies. And the mainstream media, New York Times, NBC News, ABC News perspective that fear is the dominant reaction to the prospects of a wider Middle East war is ridiculous. Right? Israel would welcome an escalation of the Middle East conflict because it will bring in the United States, right? If Israel goes after Hezbollah and Hezbollah attacks back against Israel, all right, the United States has ships in the Mediterranean that will fire off to protect Israel. The United States will come in. Israel will get to have an opportunity at least to destroy Hezbollah and their other enemies. And in this mass conflagration, if Israel starts pushing, encouraging, incentivizing Arabs in Gaza and West Bank to leave, right, that's not going to dominate the news. Right? If you have news where hundreds of Israelis are dying due to Hezbollah missile attacks and thousands of Lebanese are dying due to Israeli air attacks and ground assaults, the ethnic cleansing portion won't likely dominate the news. So fear isn't the only human reaction to the prospect of an escalating Middle East conflict. And I'm sure many of Israel's enemies would also welcome an escalation in the conflict because they believe that they have the resources to severely damage Israel, if not wipe it out. Now, the Biden administration and presidential candidate Kamala Harris, right, she fears a wider Middle East conflict because it will be really bad for her re-election campaign. So when the New York Times and the elite media just constantly frame an escalation in the Middle East conflict as terrible, just cataclysmic, awful, horrible, we're all fearing that. No. They're in part perhaps just identifying themselves with Kamala Harris's electoral prospects. I mean, you see how Google and Facebook and Instagram have rigged their searches against Donald Trump to not provide any information about the Donald Trump assassination attempt. You saw the inept Secret Service protection of Donald Trump. Charlie Kirk recently tweeted that he interviewed Donald Trump recently, and the Secret Service protection of Donald Trump was the most slack, the weakest he's ever seen. And this is after the Trump assassination attempt, that the Secret Service agent who was in charge of protection for Donald Trump at the rally where he got shot, he's still working, right? He's still out there doing his job. He hasn't been suspended, even though he didn't care to put anyone on a roof where the sniper was shooting from. And so you have a leak from someone in and around the Secret Service writing to Real Clear Politics that they're absolutely sure there will be another assassination attempt on Donald Trump because Secret Service protection is so pathetic. And if you read one book on the Secret Service, it's called Zero Fail by Carol Leonig of the Washington Post. She begins it with an anecdote from a longtime member of the Secret Service who'd wanted to be in the Secret Service since he was a boy, and he was having drinks with a Navy SEAL. He asked the Navy SEAL, "What do you think about Secret Service capabilities?" And the Navy SEAL pointed out to him, "You'll be crushed in any serious assassination attempt, right? If a loner 20-year-old could shoot Donald Trump with relative ease on Saturday, just imagine what a crack assassination team could do, right? Our Secret Service agency is just completely unprepared, unorganized, undisciplined, demoralized by diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if America votes for Kamala Harris, right, she is the ultimate diversity, equity, inclusion candidate, and America will be signing on for a massive wave of demoralization as more and more of our institutions become reduced due to affirmative action. Now, Kamala Harris has ignited energy among the Democrats. So what does that mean when we say that presidential candidate Kamala Harris has ignited energy? That means that she is getting on the same page with her most passionate Democratic supporters, right? This is how we ignite energy with other people. We get on the same page with them, right? We share a similar reality. And then we develop a rhythm, a synchronicity, a back and forth. So in a healthy, normal conversation, right, there's less than a second gap between when someone stops speaking and then the other person starts speaking. And when those gaps get longer and longer, or when people are continually interrupting each other, right, it's a sign that you've gotten out of rhythm with each other. And people who get out of rhythm with each other don't tend to establish a bond. But when you develop a rhythm with other people, you will establish a bond, and out of that bond will come an ethic, a morality, a shared way of looking at the world. Simply marching in unison with people creates increased group cohesion and group unity and social trust and a feeling of commitment to each other. So you meet someone at yoga, right? And when you meet people at yoga or at church or some kind of elevated experience, right, people's defenses tend to be down, right? You're more likely to be able to bond with other people. And then out of that bond will always come an ethic, right? You meet someone at synagogue, and then you can often call them during the week and ask for their expertise, ask for their help. And speaking of expertise, did you see this great article in the New York Times today about how Olympic champion table tennis players are continually greeted by people who think that they know how to play ping pong and can take a few points from them, but very few people can even return a serve from an Olympic table tennis competitor. So expertise matters, all right? You wouldn't be able to even return a serve from Olympic competitors in table tennis. So it doesn't mean that the elite are always right. It doesn't mean that we should always bow to expertise that we don't understand. But expertise matters. And so that's why the Republicans have been so successful capturing the United States Supreme Court, because they have followed a policy and developed a federalist society to groom elite conservative attorneys who then rise in power, help each other. And now the United States Supreme Court is solidly on the side of conservatives, but this is the result of 53 years of work. Right? There was a conservative Supreme Court Justice Powell, I believe in 1971, who wrote a memo about the need for conservatives to develop a conservative legal movement. And then I think David Horowitz wrote a big memo in 1980 along the same lines. You had the launch of the Federalist Society, and tens of millions of dollars were poured into these institutions and approaches to develop a formidable legal expertise among conservatives to increase their chances of having an effect on society. So with table tennis and with law, right, expertise matters. You really want to have the smartest, sharpest people on your side. You're going to be able to get a whole lot more done that way. And you also need to have energy on your side. And so the way that conservatives can develop energy, right, can pack arenas, right, is something that Donald Trump has the ability to do, and that is he gets into a rhythm with his supporters. They share a similar reality. He uses kind of a call and response approach, a little bit similar to some black preachers. Right? Why do black preachers get so much energy from their congregation? Because they use a rhetorical approach that gets the congregation into the talk. So sometimes I've been at talks and an intellectual wants to involve me, and so he'll point out, look, as you wrote on your blog, or as you said in this video, or as we've discussed, right, you bring people in, and that creates energy, all right? You create that connection, and then you get on the same page, you find things that you have in common, then you build on that into a rhythm, and you're going back and forth on the same page, right? You're seeing reality in a similar way, and that creates energy. And so successful people are able to ride on these waves of energy as they go through the day. And that's how successful people are able to get so much done, because they're constantly recharging their energy from the time they walk past the receptionist to greeting people at work to going to lunch with people, having phone calls, right? Because able to quickly get on the same page, share the same reality, and then build a rapport from there. And this is what Kamala Harris is doing right now. She has formidable people organizing her campaign. So this isn't Kamala, because we saw what an absolute disaster her own campaign was. So she has very few people running her campaign right now who have been with her for a long time, because when people get to know Kamala Harris, they increasingly dislike her, because due to her insecurity, she doesn't take much responsibility for her choices. And so she will then feel tremendous anxiety because she's so insecure, and she'll feel an overwhelming need to offload that anxiety onto her staff and to berate them for her own idiocy, for her own mistakes. And it's a very normal, natural human tendency when you're anxious, when you're ill at ease, when you see that you've made a mistake, right? The less mature you are, the more desperate you'll be to offload your anxiety onto other people, and you'll gaslight them, and you'll try to convince them that your mistake was really their mistake. And that's how Kamala operates. But right now, she has a formidable team that is keeping her highly in check. And it's quite possible that she will never give a news conference over the next 90 days of this campaign. Right? There will never be much of an opportunity for the news media to ask any searching questions of her. She probably won't give any interviews to anyone who's not already in the bag for her. She won't go off script in her speeches. She'll just follow the direction of her campaign team. And this is the first time we have a presidential candidate from a major American political party where you don't really know who's running the show. because this isn't Kamala running the show. She is an actor. She is mouthing the words that other people are writing. And it reveals how superficial the concern has been with Donald Trump demonstrating a dramatic threat to democracy, because the Democrats have just completely jettisoned that line of attack. Right? Joe Biden was using it for 5 years, and then suddenly Kamala Harris ascends to the top of the Democratic ticket, and they stop talking about how Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. Now, for the past 5 years, past 8 years, 9 years, whenever I've tried to read articles about how Donald Trump represents a mortal threat to American democracy, that if you vote for Donald Trump and he's elected, this will be the last election ever in America, that he will overturn the Constitution and rule as a dictator. Just as with articles about Russiagate, I start getting a headache, right? I just have a visceral reaction of boredom. It's just so removed from reality. Now, there are a lot of things that Donald Trump does that I think are bad for America, bad for him, bad for Republicans, right? I think denying the 2020 election result was a terrible thing that he did, and he set the grounds for January 6th. But the idea that he is set on becoming a dictator, or that he represents the end of democracy in America, is absurd. And I would just have the hardest time making my way through the articles. And I think my body was telling me an incredulous reaction to these claims, perhaps even before my mind could digest the claims, just as with certain billionaire investors, such as the gentleman from Omaha. Whenever his back starts hurting after he thinks about a particular stock, he sells it. So often your body will clue you in to what's happening before you cognitively have clarity on the issue. And so my body would get bored and restless when I try to make my way through these intricate, high IQ intellectual claims that Donald Trump represented a mortal threat to democracy. But the ease with which the Democrats threw away that line of attack and have now embraced the weird attack shows how trivial it was all along. Right? They just completely dropped it now that Kamala Harris is taking over, and just in the past 9 days they've embraced that J.D. Vance and the Republicans are weird, and their new campaign is about freedom, but it's a peculiar freedom, right? It's all about the freedom to terminate the life of a baby. That's the freedom. Reproductive freedom is such a weird and Orwellian phrasing, right? Freedom to terminate a baby. That's what freedom is. Freedom for children to see pornographic books in public schools, and to go to drag queen story hour. Right? It's not a type of freedom I think that most Americans will resonate with, but they're not doing it out of stupidity, right? They're not running along the lines of freedom and Republicans are weird because they don't have any evidence for it. It just strikes me as superficial, trivial lines of attack that may well produce a sugar high, that fire up the base, but lack intellectual substance. And then it reveals that those attacks on Donald Trump is a mortal threat to democracy. If they can be so easily given up by leading Democrats, it indicates that they were never serious attacks in the first place. And so much of our discourse that dominates politics and the news is just point scoring, rhetorical excess, just emoting things that bear no resemblance to reality. You'd think that you'd want to say things that have some kind of basis in truth. Now, I'm sure you can make many strong, logical critiques of the Republican platform, but the Republican platform strikes me as common sense: law and order, reduce immigration, stop illegal immigration, reduce refugee intake, do away with diversity, equity, inclusion, and affirmative action in government programs. Right? These seem like real issues to run on that have tremendous relevance to quality of life and to the safety and well-being of the United States of America. If you have no control of your borders, right, you are creating a massive safety hazard for American citizens, for the American nation. You have no idea of the destructive power of just one person, right? One person in the country illegally who sets out to disrupt and damage America. They could take up with a submachine gun in a shopping center and bring life in a major American city essentially to a halt. Right? They could disrupt tens of thousands of hours for productive citizens just by their heinous behavior. And the idea that, of course, you'd want to get a handle on who comes into the country is just obvious. You can't maintain any civilization unless you employ distinctions between people who are here legally and people who are here illegally. Right? Any civilization will tend to become flooded by different people than the ones who created the civilization, because outgroups will want to come in and take advantage of the excellence that's been created, and the civilization will sink unless you're able to maintain standards, unless you're able to maintain walls. Right? You cannot have a civilization without walls. Either the walls are artificial, such as what Donald Trump wants to erect across the southern border with Mexico, or the walls are natural. So the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, these are natural walls. I'm thinking, how silly must the highbrow cognitive elite who've been arguing for 8 years that Donald Trump represents a mortal threat to democracy. I mean, how silly are they? I can't take anyone seriously if they argue that Donald Trump represents a mortal threat to democracy. Because if there was any substance to this line of attack, Democrats wouldn't have wholesale abandon it for this trivial current line of attack that J.D. Vance and the Republicans are weird. And you see all the Democratic elites embracing this line that Republicans are weird, and they're all pausing before they say the word weird. They're all pantomiming, acting, performing, pretending as though it's a word that just occurred to them. And just from out of left field, they suddenly have the idea that Republicans are weird. It never occurred to them before. It's just as they are dealing with some weighty issue that's been posed to them by a TV news anchor, and now suddenly it just occurs to them, and it's bizarre, absolutely bizarre. No, Obama cannot contest the election again, and Michelle Obama has absolutely no interest in running. But isn't that like a whipsaw to go from a line of attack that democracy is under threat, democracy is in mortal peril, to Republicans are weird? I mean, doesn't that trivialize and diminish an intellectual basis for your critique of Republicans? And there are strong intellectual, moral, political, cultural critiques of Republicans. But to whipsaw from Trump is going to be a dictator to Trump is weird, it seems like such a dramatic climb down. It would strike me as just so incredibly demoralizing, but it doesn't really portend well for the depth of the Democratic ticket.